Welcome back to The Great Give, the radiothon here on WNHH 103.5 FM. And we are devoting 2 days, and we are in day 2, to help New Haven's great nonprofits raise money through the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven's Communal Great Give fundraiser. And I'm happy to report that we have exceeded $1.2 million. Great going, New Haven. And that is money being given to approximately 488 nonprofits. It's a lot of nonprofits that we have here in town. And you are doing it out there, in case you forgot, by going to thegreatgive.org. And when you get there, you dial up, you put in the organization that you would like to support. And among the representatives of some of those organizations, we have here Connecticut Voices for Children's Executive Director Ellen Shemitz. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So tell us about Connecticut Voices for Children. In a nutshell, what the mission is, what you really are worried about these days, and how you'd like listeners to pitch in and help.
Terrific. Great question. So our mission, simply put, is to ensure that every child in the state has the opportunity to reach their full potential. It's a simple mission, but unfortunately the barriers to having that mission become a reality are significant. And to your listeners, sorry, apparently I was not speaking into the mic, but our mission indeed is to ensure that every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential. Our work is focused on research and advocacy. So we look for what are the best ways that state policy can make a difference to dismantle barriers to opportunity and to ensure that there truly is equity, that every child has that opportunity. And we look at it as not only an issue of what's the right thing to do, but also what's the smart thing to do. The reality, as you know, is that Connecticut is in a significant fiscal crisis. It is also still in the throes of economic downturn. It is marred by tremendous disparity in opportunity by race and by place. And in order to address those trends, in order to turn around the state, we need to make sure that every one of our children graduates from school, remains in the state with the potential to contribute to a prepared workforce, to fuel a stronger economy, to fuel an economy that's inclusive and that really leads to shared prosperity.
But to be clear, Ellen, for listeners who might not be clear, the Connecticut Voices for Children doesn't do the actual teaching or the actual taking care of kids hands-on. Is it fair to say that you're sort of like a marvelous think tank whose focus is the whole range of child welfare issues?
Absolutely. We are a think tank, but also an advocacy organization.
Okay, so what is that distinction?
So the distinction is that oftentimes think tanks they can produce wonderful materials that they put out into the world and hope that advocacy groups that are committed to working with the legislature, with administrative organizations, hope that they will use those materials to change public policy. We have a hybrid role where we have tremendous integrity and intention in our research, and based on what we find, we then share those findings directly, not only with other colleagues and other advocates, but directly with decision makers, with state leaders, with the intent of moving public policy to improve outcomes.
So you go up and testify in relation to bills in Hartford, for example.
We testify in relations to bills. We sit on numerous commissions and committees. We work with different leaders, not just during the legislative session, but throughout the year to think about how can we craft, how can we change, how can we move public policies so that indeed every child is treated fairly. And that involves not only the child, but also the family and the community. We know that children do well when families do well, and families do well when, among other things, they have the opportunity to succeed economically, socially, and that in part has to do with community resources and whether or not the community has enough resources to make services available.
But you come to testify bearing statistics, bearing evidence that you and your group has researched.
Not only statistics and evidence, but deep analysis. One of the areas where we provide a unique voice that is, we believe, critical to moving the state forward is with respect to the state budget. There's a lot of noise about the state budget, but sometimes there isn't deep analysis. And we look at the state budget and state budget proposals We look at how they will or will not support children, and we look at trends over time. So, for example, on an annual basis, we put out the children's budget, which looks at what percentage of the state budget is invested in the well-being of children and families. And not long ago, 20 years ago, it was 40% of the state budget went to support services for children and families. It is now below 30%. That's a dramatic shift in priorities. And so our work is looking at the numbers, looking at the data, seeing where we are investing, where we're not investing, and what recommendations we can then make to realign the state budget so that it reflects our priorities and our values. Because at best, the state budget should be a reflection of our values.
That's a kind of an alarming drop in the welfare of children in the state of Connecticut. I'm curious, is there an Arkansas Voices for Children or a California Voices for Children, or are unique? And if so, are other states doing better than 30%?
Great question. So in terms of are we unique, there are across the nation, there are two different networks in which we participate. One is Voices for America's Children, and that is an alliance of advocacy organizations. And the organizations do a range of work, much of which we do as well, including education, child welfare, juvenile justice. We're also a member of another national network, which is purely focused on fiscal analysis, which is the State Priorities Project. There are a handful of other states where the state fiscal work is in the same shop as the child advocacy organization. We believe it's the best model because it is one thing to know what's best practice, but unless you understand and can address the funding issues, it's hard to move it forward. I think what's most important to understand about the state budget is that a lot of the noise that you hear out there is myth and not reality. So you hear a lot of noise about our spending is out of control. In fact, state spending has decreased year over year in a significant way. It used to be well over 10%, well, between 6 and 10% on a regular basis of growth in the state budget. It is now hovering in the 1 to 3% range year over year. So we've slowed down growth in the state budget. We have been faced, however, with a dramatic increase in our non-functional costs, and that includes the pension payments. And Connecticut is, as you know, at the bottom of the heap in terms of our fiscal responsibility of making payments into the pension fund on a timely basis. And we are now suffering from that. And children and families are suffering from that because if you look at a zero-sum game, we're going to hold the budget constant, but we have these rising non-functional costs, that's going to squeeze out important services and important programs. It doesn't need to be that way. We need to have all of the options on the table. And part of what Connecticut Voices does is look at the revenue side of the budget and looks at whether or not we are raising revenues that are adequate and whether we're raising revenues in a fair way. Despite a lot of the cries that we hear in the state about overtaxation of those with the most, our tax system is quite upside down, where we ask for those with the least to give a higher percentage of their income than we ask for those with the most. A lot of that inequity is driven by the property tax, which is so regressive, but there are other problems throughout the system. So our work looks not only at where do we need to invest in education, early childhood, and college and career readiness, so that we can indeed ensure that our children graduate ready to lead us into a stronger, a better, a more financially prosperous future, but also that we raise the money to fund these services in a way that's consistent with our values and our needs.
Well, if you want to support the Connecticut Voices for Children in doing this very important work, you go to thegreatgive.org and you put in, I guess you have to put in Connecticut Voices, right? Because there are other Connecticut organizations that would pop up if you just put in Connecticut. Is there? It really. I'm learning a lot from what you're saying. It sounds like almost as if you're looking at revenues and expenses through the lens of what benefits children, but it adds up to a kind of wholesale critique of the values of the budget in general.
It adds up to a critique of a budget process that is often driven by short-term concerns rather than long-term strategies. And perhaps the best example of that
yes, tell us like a particular fight that you were involved in recently.
we're involved in a fight, not just recently, but right now, that we actually hope some of your listeners might get engaged in terms of calling representatives and letting them know that they're watching and they care. And it's about something called the bond lock.
The bond lock.
The bond lock. The bond lock is new legislation that was passed last year in that behind the closed doors 11th hour midnight bipartisan budget.
Mm-hmm.
And in that behind closed doors, last minute behind closed doors, I just repeated myself, budget, there were a number of fiscal restraints that were put into the budget. And these were new ideas, new provisions that legislatures said would require them to act prudently in the future, that they would not spend as much, that they would not raise money in a way that might be deemed inappropriate. They sought to tie their hands. And in order to ensure that their hands stayed tied, they created what was called the bond lock, which was a provision that for any bond that the state issues from May 15th forward for the next 2 years, and those bonds cover 10-year periods, the state has to promise that except in the most extraordinary circumstances, it will not make any changes to the fiscal restraints passed as part of this last-minute behind closed doors budget. The problem is we need our legislators to be leaders. We need our legislators to make sound decisions based on what is in front of them, not to say we don't trust ourselves and we are going to toss any number of fiscal tools and fiscal options out the window so that we can't do bad things, but we also can't do good things, and we can't respond to unanticipated challenges or crises. If this bond lock goes forward, the state will not have the ability to respond flexibly to any number of financial, environmental, educational challenges that come up. Moreover, it puts the state at risk for actually facing increased financial costs because this bond lock is so broad that there are not examples from other states of similar bond covenants that are so broad that tie the hands of the legislatures in such an extreme way.
Mm.
There's the threat of litigation because arguably this bond lock abridges sovereign immunity or the powers of the legislature that it's not allowed to delegate to someone else, let alone give to Wall Street, which this does.
But Ellen, I thought there was always a cap on every budget season. There was a cap on the dollar amount of bonds that could be issued each year. So this bond lock is a kind of limitation over and above.
It is way over and above. So yes, you're absolutely right. There is a bond lock that is established. I mean, a bond cap that is established. But this bond lock would lock into place for the next basically 12-year period once a bond is issued. The exact bond cap, so the exact number, not being flexible to what the demands of any particular year are. It would lock into place how much the legislature was able to spend. It would lock into place how much of the income tax revenue from estimates and finals, so basically investment income, how much of that we could actually spend. It would lock into place how much we could actually use of monies that were appropriated.
So super fiscal hawk conservatives are behind this matter to the detriment of flexibility that might be needed to address children's needs or others during that period?
Interestingly, it is not a pure fiscal hawk versus non-fiscal hawk situation. It was at the outset, but I'm pleased to say that as we've been able to speak to legislators on both sides of the aisle, legislators have become very alarmed about the untested nature of this bond lock and the fact that it could likely put the state in a worse fiscal situation as a structural matter than where we are right now.
But the intent was the opposite, was by the lights of those who fashioned this, to put the state in a fiscally more responsible position, I gather.
The intent was the opposite, to make us fiscally more sound.
Mm.
But what's ironic is the idea was that we would make better decisions by not allowing us to make decisions. Right? So what someone from, I believe it was either Standard & Poor's or Moody's wrote about is that effectively what this does is it creates a constitutional amendment locking the hands of the legislators without the messy process of a constitutional amendment. In other words, we bypass democratic processes and we contract out to Wall Street the ability to hold our feet to the fire and to limit our options. And we do so because it's hard to make tough decisions. But I think legislators are starting to realize that if they give away the tools to, the shop, if they give away the tools that they need to govern, it's going to make it harder for whomever is in power. That said, it's a legislative season. I mean, it's an election season, right? And so it is hard for legislators to turn around and push back on something they adopted just last year. That's why it's so important that while it is somewhat esoteric, and I agree to many, not a very sexy topic, it's actually something that is vital that action is taken, that before the legislature convenes on May 9th, that there be action to pass new legislation to amend that bond lock, to make it into a study bill, and to say, look, before we absolutely lock ourselves into a corner and throw away the key, let's make sure we understand the fiscal implications, and let's make sure we're not doing something unwise simply because it might sound good on paper in terms of fiscal conservativeness.
All right, that is Ellen Shemitz running up the flag of worry, serious worry about the bond lock. And on behalf of Connecticut Voices for Children, call up your legislators to explore taking some action before the end of the session on this matter. And in the process, support Connecticut Voices for Children by going to thegreatgive.org, because this is complicated work that I imagine reflects a staff of economists, researchers, lawyers, financial people. And I can tell in listening to you that a lot of your what you call advocacy is sort of teaching people to look carefully at these materials, teaching legislators as well as citizens. So before we go, is there do you have a final word? Any new initiatives of the organization, and any particular needs that you'd like to put out there on The Great Give?
I guess my final word would be one of optimism, that it has become popular these days to talk about the challenges that Connecticut faces, and they are many, and they are indeed troublesome. But Connecticut also has many resources and many attributes. We need to tap those. We need to be willing to think about who do we want to be, where do we want the state to be in 20 years, and how do we make strategic investments to get us there. Connecticut's a beautiful state. It's a remarkable state, but it needs to live up to its potential. It needs to make a real commitment to equity, and then it needs to think about what steps are necessary to make that equity a reality.
All right. If you love an optimistic gadfly organization like Connecticut Voices for Children, go to thegreatgive.org and dial up Connecticut Voices and support the work of these wonderfully astute folks at Connecticut Voices for Children. I think we're going to take a brief musical break, right, Harry? And then we'll resume before the end of the hour with another of the 488 organizations participating in The Great Give. You're all doing fine out there, Connecticut. Keep it up.